I'm going to walk over here to the mic. And it's my pleasure today to introduce today's speaker. This is Jordan Kim. This is his master's exit seminar. And Jordan is a native Marylander, and he also was an ENST undergraduate in soils. That's where I met Jordan a few years ago when he took my wetland soils class. And then after he graduated, he went out and worked in the private sector for a couple of years. It's always a good experience to see how the consulting world and the private sector work out there. But he came back here in the fall of 2020, just as we were getting to navigate COVID. And so he did all his planning that first year. Last summer, he had a really great field season. And as a result of that and the lab work since then, he's generated a lot of really interesting data, and I would say important data. And so he's going to tell you a little bit about some of that today. So, Jordan.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Hi, everybody. My name is Jordan. This is my exit seminar for my project titled The Distribution and Variability of Carbon Stocks in Mid-Atlantic Tidal Marsh Soils. So we have a lot of things to present today, so I'd like to just hop right in and get started. Let's see. Okay, so I want to start off talking about blue carbon and carbon stocks. Blue carbon is the carbon that is stored in coastal ecosystems. So things like tidal marshes, mangrove forest, or seagrass beds. And this is really important as we navigate this new world where we're having climate change, and having a good estimation of this blue carbon also emphasizes the need for the preservation of these coastal ecosystems. Especially important are tidal marshes in their soils because of because they have such a small aerial extent, or despite the fact that they have a small aerial extent, they store a large amount of carbon. And this is because tidal marshes accrete vertically in response to sea level rise through inputs of organic matter and mineral matter that are high in carbon. So therefore, tidal marshes have a very large carbon storing potential compared to terrestrial wetlands. However, tidal marshes haven't been studied as extensively as terrestrial soils, so that has led to a limited, reliable data set surrounding tidal marsh soils. One of the ways to measure carbon in ecosystems is with carbon stocks, and carbon is just a measure of carbon storage in terms of mass per unit of area. So, for example, kilograms per meter squared. And it is the product of bulk density times organic carbon times horizon thickness. So if you multiply these three things together, you get carbon stocks. In the past, in tidal marshes, carbon stocks have been calculated to relatively shallow depths, sometimes even less than 50 centimeters. And this can give you a pretty large underestimation of the amount of carbon stored in these systems, because if this horizon thickness or sample depth is small, then your overall carbon stock value will also be small. So we're going to see a little bit later how shallow sampling depths can impact carbon stock measurements in tidal marshes. Because of the importance of carbon and blue carbon, especially in tidal marshes, there have been a number of efforts to estimate the amount of blue carbon stored in these areas. One of these efforts was by Holmquist et al. In 2018. And this was a big statistical data analysis paper, and they were trying to find the best method to estimate carbon in tidal marshes. However, the conclusion they settled on, we think, is overly generalized because it doesn't pay attention to the diversity in the soils and the tidal marsh ecosystems that exist. More generally, there's a lack of what we consider to be good data in tidal marsh soils. A lot of the existing data sets might have organic carbon information or horizon thickness information. However, they lack a lot of the times bulk density. So without bulk density, you don't have carbon stocks because it's one of the three main ingredients that you need to calculate carbon. So the overall purpose of our project was to use our knowledge of soil morphology and also our knowledge of tidal marsh geomorphology in order to calculate carbon stocks, real carbon stocks in our study sites, and also find ways to better estimate carbon stocks in other tidal marshes that we didn't study. So one of the central concepts to this project is this idea of the pedogeomorphic unit. And a pedogeomorphic unit, or PGU for short, is a distinct area in which a tidal marsh occurs. So these areas are all unique in their location, their formation, and also their geomorphology. So these three things will affect the soil properties. This idea is an existing concept. In the state of Maryland, it was first written about in 1979 by Darmody and Foss. And the purpose of that research was to identify the major groupings of geomorphic settings in the state of Maryland where tidal marshes occur. So the three main groupings they identified were the submerged upland marshes, the estuarine marshes, and also the coastal marshes. So in our project, we're expanding upon that idea slightly. You see we have 5 pedogeomorphic units we use in this study. The submerged upland is staying the same. The estuarine marshes we split out into a fresh and non-fresh component, largely due to the differences in biogeochemistry happening in brackish marshes, such as the increase in salt rate reduction and also the fact that they have different plant communities. We also split out the coastal marshes into 2 separate components, the barrier island marshes and the mainland side marshes. And this was due to the differences in soil texture that we would expect in these 2 systems. So I will be talking about these 5 in more detail later throughout the rest of the talk. But for now, I do want to just leave you with this distribution map of the tidal marshes in the Mid-Atlantic categorized by their pedogeomorphic unit. We have a legend at the top color-coded and also in parentheses the percent of total area occupied by those geomorphic settings. Some quick observations here. We see that in Maryland, we have a large diversity of tidal marshes. We have all the 5 types here. Most of the submerged upland exists in our state, and we see the presence of estuarine marshes along these major rivers in the red and the yellow. So here's like the Patuxent, the Choptank, the Nanticoke, etc. In Delaware and New Jersey, we have a lot of estuarine marshes along the Delaware Bay, and also we have this large swath of coastal marshes in the blue and the purple along the Jersey shore. So if you read our abstract, you might have noticed we did a lot of field work over the summer. We had 28 transects that we established across our study site among these 5 pedogeomorphic units. This map shows the location of all of our transects. We stayed mostly in Maryland. However, we did have a couple of sites in Delaware and New Jersey. So these transects always extended from the upland edge, usually like a forest or an ag field, and they went straight out to the water's edge. Along each transect, we had between 3 and 5 points where we described the soil morphological characteristics. And in this example, this is a transect where we had 5 description points. So with those descriptions, we took out a long core from the marsh, and we described where the major horizons or layers were. We described what the textures were and the colors were, among a variety of other morphological characteristics. We were able to do this with the aid of a few tools, including our Macaulay sampler, which I'm showing in the picture on the left. This is a soil sampling device used for very soft and fluid soils, where you get this really nice, intact, undisturbed half core, where you can also get bulk density measurements from, because we actually know the volume of the sampling device itself. So speaking of sampling, let me take a water break. We took soil samples from roughly 50% of all the points that we described. And when we took samples, they came from the individual horizons rather than some fixed depth like 0 to 50, for example. So that gave us a total of 455 horizons in our data set. And so if we visualize this data set as these long rectangles, imagine they go from sample number 1 at the top all the way down to 455 at the bottom. We were able to get bulk density, organic carbon, and horizon thickness that came from our field descriptions. And you might see where I'm going with this. These 3 things multiplied together give you real, concrete, measured carbon stocks, okay, on a horizon basis and also on a soil profile basis. One thing I want to mention about the bulk density here, in roughly 30% of those samples, we weren't able to get bulk density, and that was because the soil is very dense, and so we couldn't push our Macaulay sampler through it. So what we did for those, roughly 30%, is we estimated their bulk densities using external data for soils that were very similar to our tidal marsh soils. We feel okay with this generally speaking because those soils were, again, very dense, and they also had very low amounts of carbon. So even if our bulk density measurements or estimations were off by a little bit, since they had such little organic carbon, maybe less than 0.1%, the overall impact on carbon stocks was very small. So we've talked about blue carbon, we've talked about the 5 pedogeomorphic units. So for the remainder of this talk, I'd like to go through each of these 5 in more detail and show you how the soils and how the carbon stocks differ among them. And I'd like to start with the submerged uplands. The submerged upland marshes, as the name might imply, are these former upland non-marsh areas that became inundated by sea level rise over the past several thousand years. These are very gently sloping landscapes. The slope is kind of imperceptible by your eye, but because it slopes downward, you can imagine that sea level is rising higher and higher and higher over time, and this marsh is kind of transgressing in a landward direction, replacing the existing vegetation, usually like a forest. So one of the products we get from that is what we call ghost forests, which is what's pictured in the background here. If you were to look to the left, you'd see a nice, healthy loblolly pine forest, but as you get closer to the marsh, the trees are starting to feel the effects of the tidal inundation, the brackish water, and so they start to die off. And what we get is this kind of gradient of dead and dying trees until you're in the marsh proper. The submerged upland marshes are located mostly in Maryland, in these very low-lying areas that have been most affected by sea level rise. So in our state, mostly along the coasts of Dorchester and Somerset County. And of course, we have to talk about their soils. These submerged upland soils, you can think of them as like drowned upland terrestrial soils. They might have started out looking something exactly like this with this slightly darkened topsoil layer that is enriched in organic carbon, and below that you have this layer of clay enrichment that is very low in organic carbon. But after a period of sea level rise and subsequent organic matter accumulation due to the highly anaerobic conditions, they might have ended up looking something like this today, where we still have this upland, former upland soil surface now, but it's been buried by this layer of accumulating organic matter. Another characteristic about these soils is that due to the that sloping, gradually sloping landscape, they have thicker organic surface horizons closer to the water, where the marsh is older, it's had more time to accrete, and very thin organic horizons closer to the upland forest, where the marsh is younger, and that organic layer hasn't had as much time to accrete. So maybe this diagram shows it a little better. We see here our ghost forest that's grading into the marsh, and this gradually thickening organic layer above what is now the former upland surface. Now, I've exaggerated the slope in this picture just for the illustration, but again, if you're there in real life, you wouldn't really be able to see that slope. It looks pretty flat. And so below that, we still have this layer of clay enrichment, very low carbon, and again, below that, this sandy coastal plain sediment that is even lower in carbon. So you might expect that in these marshes closer to the water, where this organic matter horizon is much thicker, they would have larger carbon stocks. And you might expect the opposite on the upland edge, where the organic horizon is thinner. They might have lower carbon stocks. So this is actually exactly what we've observed in a lot of our submerged upland transects. The figure you're seeing here is soil data from one submerged upland transect, where we described 4 points, and each of those points is represented by a line. On the y-axis is the depth below the surface. So the lower you go on the y-axis, the further underground you're going. And on the x-axis is not carbon density, it's not carbon stocks, but carbon density. And carbon density is similar to stocks. It's just the product of bulk density and organic carbon alone. So what you can do is you can kind of simplify the equation for carbon stocks to say that it equals carbon density times horizon thickness. So going back to the graph, the area to the left of each of these lines represents carbon stocks. The larger that area, the larger the carbon stocks. So getting back to what I said just a second ago, I'd like to first point out this solid green line. This represents the soil description points closest to the upland. Here it is on a map. This is where the organic horizon is thinner, and so we would expect lower carbon stocks. And this is what we're seeing in our data. The carbon stock, or carbon density, I should say, starts out quite high. And then by the time you get to around 50 centimeters, that's at that point, you've probably entered into these low carbon clay rich layers, which is why we're seeing this kind of steep drop off at this point. There's not a lot of carbon at that depth. This is the exact opposite of what we see at the water's edge, where that organic horizon might be thicker. The carbon density and therefore carbon stocks start high, and they remain high until about 120 or 130 centimeters, which at that point you're probably transitioning into a lower carbon subsoil. So the submerged upland marshes show this pretty clear spatial trend in carbon carbon stocks throughout the marsh. So now I'd like to move on to the estuarine marshes, starting with the estuarine fresh. These marshes formed from river or stream channels that have filled in with mineral sediment or organic matter. They're located along major rivers in our state. So this example is showing the Patuxent River, and all the areas in yellow are the freshwater estuarine marshes. The soils there are generally very deep due to the geomorphology of these river channels. The soils are also, they tend to have very thick organic horizons and this very fine fluid mineral soil material. Because of the very slow moving water in these giant rivers, that's allowed the really fine particles of like silt and clay to settle out. So we get some pretty fine textured soil materials here. And also due to the saturated conditions that they were formed in, they're very fluid. So if you were to take one of these soils and kind of squeeze them between your hands, it would all come flowing out between your fingers. So regardless of whether we're talking about mineral soil material or organic soil material in these marshes, they both have pretty high carbon. Like you see in this photo, this is a mineral horizon that's very dark, indicating that it has a lot of organic matter and therefore organic carbon in it. So these estuarine marshes store a lot of carbon. So I want to move right on to the non-fresh. These are essentially the same, except now we're a little bit further downstream where the water is considered brackish. We have slightly different plant communities, but the soils themselves are largely the same. They have very thick organic horizons and this fluid, fine textured mineral soil that's also very deep and very high in carbon. Because of the fluidity of these soils, they have very low bearing capacities, which means that it was very difficult at times to navigate these marshes. You see Isabel and Evan here, both up to their knees and their thighs, sinking into the marsh as we tried to get across them. So it was very challenging at times, to say the least. Here's another cross section. This represents both the fresh and the non-fresh marsh. I would like to point out first these very steeply sloping sides that kind of give the bottom of this marsh this trough shape, that contributing to the depth of these marshes. You'll note that on the vertical scale here, I say that they might extend to over 10 meters. We really don't know, but we do know that they're very deep. The longest or the deepest soil core we described here was about 3.5 meters. So we have plans to go out and try to find the bottom of one of these marshes over the summer. So stay tuned on that. The soils here are largely organic over mineral material. However, in these riverine systems, we get a lot of deposition and burial of different things. So it's not very uncommon to see a lot of stratification of these different types of material within each other, especially up here at the water's edge, where you might have eroded sediment from upstream being dumped and deposited on top of the marsh. Before I do that, because of how deep these marshes are, you don't have to go very far in before you start getting, again, very deep soils that are high in carbon. So they don't exhibit a very clear spatial trend in carbon stocks like the submerged uplands did. The only exception to that rule might be if you're up here very close to the upland where the marsh is still kind of shallow. If you were to take a soil sample, you might actually hit the bottom of this marsh and grab a little bit of this very sandy coastal plain sediment that's low in carbon. And we actually encountered that a couple of times, and I'll show you data on that in just a second here. So here's another line graph. It's organized in the same way: carbon density on the X and depth below the surface on the right, or on the Y-axis. Here's a transect from a freshwater marsh where we also described 4 soils. And you can see that, regardless of where you are in this transect, whether you're at the upland edge or the water's edge, carbon stocks are starting high and remaining high all the way throughout the profile. So this reinforces this idea that there's not a lot of spatial variability in carbon throughout an estuarine marsh. Here's another example from a brackish marsh. Again, we see this generally the same pattern where carbon density and carbon stocks are remaining high throughout the profile, but this solid blue line is that exception that I just mentioned, where you might be at the upland edge of a marsh and where the soils aren't very deep yet. So carbon density and carbon stocks might start high, but by the time we got to about 1 meter in the soil, we started transitioning into a very sandy soil that's low in carbon. And if you're curious, here's a picture of that exact soil represented by the solid blue line. At the surface, we had some very organic matter rich, dark colored soils. But again, by about a meter deep, where the marsh isn't where the marsh is still quite shallow, we started grabbing these sandy, light colored, low carbon soil materials. So now here's the fourth pedogeomorphic unit. Some of you here might have been to Astig Island before. This is a picture right after you cross the bridge, looking out to your right. And we see these tidal marshes that are attached to the back of the barrier island. And this picture is showing a view from inside of the marsh itself. So these tidal marshes have formed from the deposition of sand following some sort of overwash event, like a storm or a hurricane that might have swept the sand from the beaches and the dunes out into the coastal lagoon behind the island. Here's a close-up shot of Astig Island, Maryland, and all the areas in blue are these barrier island marshes. And so perhaps it's not super surprising due to the nature of the sediments that were deposited. The soils there are very, very sandy. We still did have some organic surface horizons. However, they were pretty thin. Usually we describe surface organic horizons that were about a foot deep. I think at the most we had one that was maybe 50 centimeters. But below that, we had this light colored sand that has little to no carbon in it. Here's some more great artwork of the coastal barrier island cross section. I want to point out again, this very thin organic layer. In a couple cases, we had a slightly thickening organic layer as we went out closer to the water. However, it wasn't as clear or extreme of a pattern as we observed in the submerged upland marshes. Below that organic layer is sand, very little carbon in that. And the last thing I want to show you in this diagram are these buried surface horizons. So that happens as you have continual deposition of sand from the beaches and the dunes over onto the marsh surface over and over again. So you're kind of getting this, a buried surface layer. And so these are more common in like the dunal wetland systems. However, we did find and describe a few in the actual marsh itself. All right, our line graph again. I'm showing all of the coastal barrier soils that we sampled. And I'm doing that because they all show the same exact pattern. The carbon density and carbon stocks start out pretty high because of that organic surface layer, but because it was so thin, by the time you get down to 30 or 40 centimeters, you're kind of dropping off a cliff in terms of carbon density. This is where we start to get those really low carbon sands. So after that, carbon density and carbon stocks remain low all the way down throughout the profile. Okay, this is our fifth pedogeomorphic setting. This is the coastal mainland marsh. Now we're on the opposite side of the water as the barrier islands. You see Assateague way out here, 5 or 6 miles away. These are marshes that form from water deposit sediments in the coastal lagoon along the mainland coast. So all these purple areas along the edge of Worcester County, opposite of the barrier islands. The soils there are also very fluid and fine textured like the estuarine marshes, because again, the body of water that deposited these sediments is very large, very low energy, slow moving, so that therefore a lot of silts and clays, these very small particles, were allowed to settle out. The only difference from the estuarine marshes is that the soils there are not as deep. The geomorphology of these landscapes are not as steeply sloping as the estuarine marshes are. So we tended to kind of hit the bottom of the marsh a little bit more often than we did in the estuarine marshes. So here in this diagram, you can see that it kind of has a similar trough shape as the estuarine marshes, but again, the sides leading in aren't that steeply sloping. So again, we don't have a very deep marsh. We still do have a lot of organic and mineral material in these systems and a lot of interstratification of that in the subsoil. And here's the same picture from the last slide showing that interstratification where we have this really light colored gray mineral soil material, and we see this very sharp abrupt boundary when it transitions to this buried organic layer. So our line graph here, similar to the estuarine marshes, the coastal mainland marshes had soils that started high in carbon density and remained high in carbon density and carbon stocks. However, like I mentioned before, they're not as deep. So oftentimes right around 2 meters, we started to pick up a little bit more sandy soil material that was a little bit lower in carbon. So that explains this drop off in carbon density right around 2 meters. And here's another example that shows the same thing from a different coastal mainland transect, where we had high carbon stocks and carbon density throughout the profile. And then, right about 2 meters, we started to get some more sandy material, indicating that we were kind of getting to the bottom of the tidal marsh. Okay, so we've talked about how carbon stocks vary within each pedogeomorphic unit. So now I kind of want to take a step back and show you how they compare amongst each other. Before I do that, I want to preface this by saying something I mentioned earlier, I think, that carbon stocks in tidal marshes haven't always been calculated to very deep depths. Some studies have reported carbon stocks in these systems to less than 50 centimeters. And so we're going to see here how that shallow sampling depth can greatly overestimate carbon stocks in tidal marshes. So starting out with this box plot, we have the carbon stocks for all of these sampled soils split up by the pedogeomorphic unit on the x-axis. And on the y-axis is the carbon stock itself. And so what we've shown here is what the carbon stocks are like in each of these 5 settings if you were to only calculate them to 50 centimeters. And so you see at that shallow depth, there's really no difference in terms of pedogeomorphic setting and carbon stocks. These are all essentially the same. It's not until you start going a little bit deeper, now we're at a meter, when some differences start to emerge in the carbon stocks. In the 2 estuarine marshes, the fresh and the non-fresh here, we start to see those creep upwards a little bit, and we see the sandy coastal barrier marshes kind of getting left behind in last place. And so if we go to 2 meters, calculate these stocks at 2 meters, this is when the differences are most obvious. The estuarine marshes, these are the very deep soils with very high amounts of organic matter and organic carbon. And so these have the greatest carbon stocks. The coastal mainland, not too far behind, they had similar soils, but they're not as deep. Therefore, the carbon stocks are a little bit less. And then in dead last place, we have these very sandy coastal barrier marshes with a thin organic horizon and low carbon sand below that. So that, these coastal barrier marshes store very little carbon in comparison. So I think these figures kind of emphasize the importance of soil morphology. We know that different types of soil materials have different amounts of carbon, different bulk densities. So that's why it's important for us to consider that in our calculation of carbon stocks in tidal marshes. And also, as a reminder, carbon stocks are partially a function of depth. So the larger the sampling depth or horizon thickness, the larger carbon stocks are going to be. I do want to say that these are calculated to 2 meters. We have the data to this depth. We're not extrapolating to 2 meters to make these figures. These are all real numbers and emphasize the importance of deep sampling in tidal marshes. So here's a similar figure that's slightly different. This figure shows the percent of carbon stocks that you would capture. Sorry, let me say that one more time. I don't have my speaker notes on this computer. This figure is showing the percent of carbon stored in the upper 2 meters of the soil that you would capture in the upper 50 centimeters in the blue and the upper 100 centimeters in the red. So I just want to start off with looking at the coastal barrier marshes. You see that regardless of if you sample to 50 or 100 centimeters in these systems, you're capturing 80 to 90, almost 100% of the carbon that's stored in the upper 2 meters of the soil. Now that is a lot different than the coastal mainland and the 2 estuarine marshes. If you were to sample the soils to 50 centimeters in these settings, you only capture maybe a quarter, maybe a third of the carbon stored in the upper 2 meters, right? These are where the soils are very deep and very high in carbon. Now, if you sample them to 100 centimeters, you're doing a lot better, but our data shows that you still only capture roughly half or maybe a little bit more of that carbon stored in the upper 2 meters. And finally, I want to point out the submerged uplands, particularly the box in the blue showing the carbon captured in the upper 50 centimeters. We see it has a very wide range, and that's probably due to the spatial variation or spatial distribution of carbon within the submerged upland marsh. Those are the settings where we have this gradually thickening organic horizon that stores more carbon toward the water's edge and less carbon towards the upland edge. So if you were to sample those soils to 50 centimeters at the upland edge where that organic horizon is thin, you might be capturing a good amount, most of the carbon. But if you were to do that same thing at the water's edge where the organic horizon is very thick, you might only be capturing 20 to 30%. So this figure, I think, helps to answer the question, how deep do you sample tidal marshes? And we think the answer to that question is it depends. If you're in a coastal barrier island marsh or parts of a submerged upland marsh, a meter might be great. You might be capturing most of that carbon. But if you're in these three settings, the coastal mainland or the estuarine marshes, sampling to a meter might just be scratching the surface. So it might be advisable to go as deep as you possibly can in those settings. Okay, so if you remember back to the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that one of our other goals in this project was to better estimate the carbon stored in other tidal marshes that we didn't visit. And you might be wondering how we do that if we don't have laboratory data, because you need bulk density, you need organic carbon and horizon thickness to calculate carbon stocks. So we think that to answer that question, the answer lies with carbon density. And carbon density, as a reminder, is this down here, just bulk density times organic carbon. What we've done with all our 455 samples is we categorize them based on their general material type. And we boiled it down to these 9 categories. So any one of our 455 samples would fit into one of these 9 categories. And what we did is we calculated the mean carbon density for those materials. So if you have this mean carbon density, and if you have a good soil morphological description that tells you the horizon thickness, what you can do is just multiply this carbon density times the horizon thickness of any given tidal marsh soil description and get a reasonable estimate of carbon stocks. And so that's what we've done here in this little thought experiment. We've compared our real carbon stocks shown on the x-axis and compared them to our modeled carbon stocks. We're calling them modeled on the y-axis. And we got these modeled values from multiplying the mean carbon density times the horizon thickness from the morphological description. And you see that we have a very good R-squared value of 0.8. P is highly significant. So this shows that with this method of using carbon density to model carbon stocks, we can get a pretty reasonable estimate of carbon in the absence of laboratory data. So now we're at the end. In conclusion, we have found significantly different carbon stocks among these 5 pedogeomorphic settings. And this is due to, 1, the geomorphic setting in which the marsh is formed, and also the soil morphology. Second, we've learned that sampling depth is very important in tidal marshes. Sometimes 1 meter is perfectly fine, like in those sandy barrier island marshes, but other times this is barely enough, like in the very deep carbon-rich estuarine marshes. And third, from the last slide, we found that carbon density can give you a reasonable estimate of carbon stocks in the absence of laboratory data. All you really need is a good soil description and some information about the geomorphic setting that you're in. So that's all I have for you today. But before I formally conclude, I want to give some acknowledgements first to my advisor, Dr. Ravenhorst. It's been really great working on this project. I've had a lot of fun. I've learned a lot, and I'm very thankful for the close guidance that he's given me over the past 1.5 years. I also want to thank our committee members, Dr. Baldwin and Dr. Needleman. We're very lucky to have a couple of wetland and soil experts working with us. And I also want to thank the department here, ENST. Very lucky to be a part of this department and looking forward to finishing out. But last but not least, I want to extend my gratitude to my lab mates, past and present, Aaron, Isabel, Jocelyn, and Evan. They're out with me all the time in the field. It was incredibly difficult and challenging at times, but I thought we did a great job. We had a lot of fun. So I really appreciate your dedication, your support, and also your friendship. So thank you, everybody. Appreciate you listening, and I hope you enjoyed.
Time time for some questions here before we launch in. Let me remind you that you all should have received a link to an evaluation form to come in your email in the last 10 minutes or so. And also anybody that's tuning in online, just put it in the chat box. So we would appreciate your completing that evaluation. So with that, questions?
Yes.
Thanks for the talk. For your upland sites, those ghost forests, was there a lot of variation in the extent of that being affected by sea level rise?
Yeah.
Invasive plants like Phragmites coming into them?
Yeah, we did tend to see a lot of frag at the upland edge in those ghost forests, and we also did see a lot of variation in how large those ghost forests were. In a couple of sites, they were pretty small or non-existent even. But at that Blackwater site, that was a good ghost forest, but definitely not the largest that exists. Yeah.
Do you think that affects your results essentially? Would your sample sites kind of represent those sorts of
When we sampled those soils in those submerged upland marshes, we wanted to stay within the marsh. So in that picture, we were like right outside the edge of that ghost forest. So we never really were in the midst of the ghost forest while sampling. So we would always stay within the marsh proper, you know. Yeah. Yes.
Very nice job.
Thank you.
I had a question also about the kind of ghost forest schematic that you had, and could you put a time table on that, so where you have that accumulation of the layers, you know, and I'm not, you know, just a really broad like ballpark figure of how long that takes to keep, like what is the level, I guess, of accretion?
I guess that would depend on the tidal marsh system. You know, a lot of these marshes are keeping pace with sea level rise, if I'm not mistaken. So it's hard to say how old, you know, how long it takes for a ghost forest to form.
Can your data help inform that? Can you look at your data that way? Because I mean, you did these transects across. I was just kind of curious about.
I'm sure it could. You know, we have carbon data. We don't have like carbon dating data.
Right.
But
you have to the depth of the.
Yeah, we have the depth.
Right. So,
yeah. So to the bottom of like the O horizon, we would know, you know, how much carbon is stored, and we'd also know how thick that O horizon is. So I think that it could kind of point us in that direction. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yes, Dr. Well.
Thanks, Jordan. First, I want to say that it's been a pleasure working with you over the years.
Thank you.
I had you in a number of classes that you worked with me as a TA, and it's always been great. You've been very collegial. And I was thinking, is this a master's or a PhD? Pretty extensive investigative study. So with those comments, I have a couple of questions. Seem to be focused on this idea of carbon stocks. A lot of people are. The depth to which that's measured varies widely. Usually it's 30 centimeters for good enough soil. Yeah. So, and when we know that a lot of the carbon in the global soils are meters deep in the the Arctic and the northern discosols. How deep? What's your reason? I assume your reason for being interested in estimating the stocks is for global climate models and carbon cycling, carbon sequestration. So to what depth is this carbon in play? So if you have carbon at say 2 meters, or in some of those riverine systems, 3, 6, 7, 8 meters deep, what role does that 3 meter deep or 4 meter deep carbon play in climate change?
That's a good question.
In the next century or two, that's of interest.
Yeah.
Do you have a feeling of how deep the carbon is that's likely to say if sea level drops, it's going to be released, if it rises, how it's going to be part of what's sequestered, or maybe it's going to turn into methane. So sort of what depth is important to know the stocks from?
Yeah, that's a great question.
That's something I think you should think about before you write up these results. Because really, that puts them in context.
I think there's a large biogeochemical aspect in that question, which I'm not as familiar with. But in my mind, I always think of those soils trapped meters deep to be relatively stable. However, we know that things exist down there, things happening down there that release carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. So certainly, the upper, I don't know, couple of meters, I think, are in play in this question that you're asking. But it's good because those are essentially saturated all the time. The tidal fluctuation isn't going to affect things that are that deep. So with the constant anaerobic conditions, I think most of the carbon would stay probably in place at that depth.
So in upland systems, which I'm more familiar with, we're often interested in depth because we think that current carbon is going 2 meters deep, 1 meter deep from current vegetative roots. So I have another question.
And just to add a little note, it might depend on how stable those marshes are and how well protected they are, because if they erode and that organic peat moves into the water, then it has the potential for oxidation much more easily.
So for where you have the coastal marshes are eroding, that might be one of them.
Yeah, we saw a lot of that edge erosion in those coastal systems.
So my second question has to do with taxonomy definitions. I'm wondering whether you found any examples of organic soil materials that have less carbon density than mineral soil materials.
No, I think all the organic soil materials had the highest carbon density, and we go back to that.
Well, but they're defined on carbon per unit weight, right?
Yes, 12%,
Mass,
12% or more.
right?
Yeah.
So there can be a vast difference
Yes.
depending on the fluidity of things in density.
Right. Yeah.
Oh,
So even though they
so
had low bulk
Just wondering
density,
whether that definition.
yeah, it's a hot topic right now. So this is showing our carbon density for these soil material types we described. So these first 3 rows represent all of the O horizons that we described. And even though they have such small bulk density, like 0.2 or a little bit more, a little bit less, they had carbon densities of 30 to 40 kilograms per cubic meter.
And what were the carbon percentages?
Anywhere from 12 to 45% in like organic carbon.
So some of them were as low as 12, and you would end up with a density as high as 30 or 40.
Well, these are averages among these groups. So
That's what I'm asking. Did you have individual samples where the carbon density was higher in the mineral soil than it was in the organic?
Oh yeah, I'm sure we did. There was probably a little bit of overlap, but in general, with these averages and means, they're higher.
So your OAs in your fluid dark, one is mineral, one's organic. They got the same mean, so they must.
There's some overlap there, and they're also not statistically different here. Yes.
This is fabulous data set.
Thank you.
What was really struck me was how the depth at the tidal freshwater marshes, the carbon didn't.
Yeah.
Really. It was
Yeah.
still up around 20 or 30.
Mhm.
So my question is, what is the limit of that depth? I mean, your best guess. It sounds like you need to do some more.
Yeah.
And then second, it seems like on the Barrier Island, how are you sure that there's not other organic horizons below the initial sand layers?
So to answer the first question, if I'm being honest, I have no idea. But we will try to go out this summer with I don't know, a dozen Macaulay extensions and try to stick it into the ground and see if we hit the bottom. For the second question, we did find some buried surface horizons in the barrier islands. They didn't constitute a whole lot of carbon, even though they were, these buried organics. Sometimes when you describe those buried organic or buried surface horizons, I should say, you're only seeing a very slight change in the color. It might still be sandy, but it might be a little bit darker. So in those cases, the carbon would still be low because it's so sandy, even though it's just a little bit darker. But I think, if you're interested in that, if someone's interested in that, they should employ methods that can achieve deeper in coastal barrier island marshes, such as vibracoring. We didn't do any of that, but I know that's a common technique that the NRCS uses in tidal marshes, including these sandy barrier islands. So yeah.
I'm curious to what extent you think you could apply the
patterns you found in your data of carbon density by soil material type and carbon density and depth by wetland type to do carbon stock maps for Maryland or other
Right.
areas?
So we know that this works well in tidal marshes in our study area, Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey. However, if you were to do that, apply this to like a terrestrial wetland, I don't think that would be advisable. You know, they have different soils. I think in order to do that, you would need to collect, a separate data set. One of the points of the project is that we want to make sure we're, paying attention to the types of soils and calculating carbon stocks with respect to those differences. So I don't know that it would apply. It might apply well to a terrestrial wetland, but it might not, right? So I think to answer that question, you need to collect a lot more data in different types of wetlands.
But would you be able to create a map, say, for Maryland marshes in general?
Yeah, absolutely. If you had a soil description from any Maryland tidal marsh and you had GPS coordinates, so you knew what setting you were in, I think that, yes, you could apply that very, very well. Because our data, our sites, while we only visited 28 marshes, they're, I think, very representative. If you were to visit any other marsh, you wouldn't find anything that's vastly different than what we had described in our 118 soils.
All right. Let's see. Maybe here's a question online from Peter May. So any relationships made to the upper and lower carbon stock sequestration annual estimations to human carbon emissions? Say a hectare on average of this wetland type would sequester X numbers of vehicle emissions.
That's a great question. No, we haven't done that. Although I'm sure that we could if we wanted to. That's an interesting thought experiment, and more than a thought experiment. That's important to know how much carbon offset there is in tidal wetlands.
There's a question about units here. I'm not sure I quite follow, but this is from Dr. Shir Mohammadi. He says, how do you translate the units of kilograms per square meter to a bulk density unit that is generally expressed as a dry mass divided by the volume? So maybe just says sort of how do these units relate, because you use.
Right. So bulk density, we tend to measure that in grams per centimeter cubed. We can just convert that into kilograms per cubic meter times the percent organic carbon that's unitless. So if you have something like kilograms per meter cubed times horizon thickness, which is in meters, one of the meters cancels out and you get carbon stocks on a aerial basis.
All right. Well, I think you've answered all the questions. So
Great.
thanks again, Jordan.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody.